Thank you very much. The chairman has asked me to recognize Mr. Rosen.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I've spent most of the last 5 years in Iraq, with, especially with Sunni and Shia militiamen and in mosques and powers of center, other than the Green Zone. So I hope to give you a different perspective. I last left Iraq in last February, a month ago, a little over a month ago. The Bush administration and the U.S. military have stopped talking of Iraq as a grand project of nation building. The American media has obeyed this as well, and they have also abandoned the larger narrative, presenting Iraq as a series of small pieces. And just as Iraq is being physically deconstructed, it's also being intellectually deconstructed. It's no longer a state undergoing an occupation and a civil war and a transition, but small stories of local heroes and villains and well-meaning American soldiers, of good news here and progress there, but the whole is much less than the sum of its parts. Iraq is basically Somalia, leaving aside Kurdistan. When I talk about Iraq, I'm not referring to Kurdistan. You have warlords and militias controlling fiefdoms. Most of the experts who give their opinion on Iraq, such as Fred Kagan from the American Enterprise Institute, people who don't speak Arabic, who go around on babysat tours with the American soldiers, the view they present of Iraq is false, and it's very dangerous to rely on them, and they've done you a disservice. There's no shortage of Iraqis, and I applaud you for bringing Mr. Saeed, Iraqis who can speak for themselves and journalists who spent much of their time there. Now it's true that fewer Americans are dying in Iraq, and perhaps from a purely American point of view that's a success, but less Americans are dying in Iraq because Iraq is no longer, the dominant story is no longer a resistance to a foreign occupation. It's no longer a war of national liberation. Less Americans are dying because Iraq has been in a civil war. Less Americans are dying because Iraq is now a battle for control between various Iraqi factions. And the proper standard for judging progress in Iraq isn't the number of American deaths, but it's the quality of life for Iraqis. And unfortunately, for most Iraqis, life under Saddam was better. Even opponents of Saddam are saying this, and I was just a few weeks ago with people from the Mahdi army asking them, after 5 years, was life better for you under Saddam? And they said, yes, it was. Iraq doesn't exist today. It has no government. It's in the control of warlords, as I said, and events in the Green Zone have never mattered and still don't matter. It's always been a theater. The people who control power in Iraq, the militia leaders, have never inhabited the Green Zone. And therefore, focusing on laws passed in the Green Zone, on political deals made in the Green Zone or the international zone, is a distraction, and a dangerous one. Now, since the escalation of American soldiers began last year, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis have continued to flee their homes, mostly from Baghdad, and Baghdad has become virtually a Shia city, leaving aside a few Sunni pockets. So one of the main reasons why less Iraqis are dying is because there are less Iraqis to kill. The civil war was very successful in achieving the goals of the various parties. This is a key to understanding the drop in violence. Shias were cleansed from Sunni areas, and Sunnis were cleansed from Shia areas. This was bound to stop eventually. The violence was logical, and it achieved its logic. It achieved its goals. The enemy's population was displaced. And if war is politics by other means, then the Shias won, and they now control most of Iraq. Fortunately for the planners of the surge, events were working in their favor internally in the Iraqi civil war. The Sunnis had lost, and beginning in 2006, when I interacted with Sunni resistance leaders in Iraq, in Syria, and Jordan, they began to realize, oh my God, we've lost, what do we do now? And there were internal recriminations. They blamed Sunni clerics in 2003 who had issued fatwas prohibiting Sunnis from joining the Iraqi government. They began to wonder what they should do next, and they realized that from their point of view, their main opponent might have been the same main opponent that the Americans had, Iran. And many of them began to pursue that route, and they hoped that Americans would realize that they had this common enemy, although it took a while for them to come on board. In many ways, they were shocked how they became the enemy. They thought that they were the rightful rulers of Iraq, and they would have been very happy to accommodate an American presence. And you heard Iraqi resistance leaders saying this throughout the years, as long as they were the ones in power, these mostly Sunni men. Now, the Americans armed both sides in a civil war, and this has also basically allowed for some temporary stability. How are you arming both sides in a civil war? The Iraqi security forces, majority Mahdi army, of course, and now you're allowing for Sunni militiamen to arm themselves or to use money that they're being given by Americans to arm themselves. David Kilcullen, the influential counterinsurgency advisor, has defined this as balancing competing armed interest groups. Now, supporters of the war and the surge tout this as a success, but they forget that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands perhaps, of Iraqis have been killed, millions displaced, and thousands of dead and American wounded have also been a price, just so that the violence can go back to the horrifying levels it was a couple of years ago. And much of the violence doesn't get reported. American officers underreport the violence. Much of the violence just occurs outside the sight of the American military or of the media. When I was living in Baghdad these last few months, several times there were dead bodies in front of my house. This didn't make the media. A guy was shot in the head on his way to work. He was an interior ministry official. These sorts of things happen all the time. They don't get reported. Although it's true that violence is down a little bit. Now, at the same time that Sunnis were realizing they lost the civil war, Muqtada Sadr realized that his militia was out of control. He had lost control over many of his men. They were no longer merely resisting the Americans or protecting the areas from Sunnis, but they were establishing their own mafias. They were terrorizing civilians. And he feared that clashing with the Americans and with Sunnis who were being empowered would threaten his own power. And he knew that within the context of the surge, he was one of the main targets, or his militia was. So he imposed a freeze, which is often mistranslated as a ceasefire, so that he could reform his troops, he could consolidate his control over them, he could take out the bad ones, and sort of wait the Americans out. Because like the Sunnis, he knew that the Americans were bound to leave eventually. Now the Mahdi army freeze, which began in late August of last year, coincided immediately with a huge drop in violence, which, among other things, shows us just how responsible they were for the recent violence. At the same time, the Sunni militias imposed basically their own ceasefire. They had been battling the Americans, the Shias, and Al-Qaeda, and they had failed on every front. Resistance to the occupation had not succeeded in liberating Iraq from the Americans or in seizing power or overthrowing the Iraqi government. The Shia militias had won the civil war, and Sunnis were being purged from Baghdad, purged from the Iraqi state, from physically purged and also purged from ministries. The majority of the Iraqi refugees outside of Iraq were Sunni. They had initially allowed Al-Qaeda elements to enter the areas to protect them from the Americans and from the Shias. But while this has been a temporarily successful tactic, Al-Qaeda began to impose its own reign of terror in Sunni areas, establishing its own mafias. It's not bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. Oftentimes, these would be familiar to inner-city Americans, teenagers stealing cars, calling themselves Al-Qaeda because it sounds cool. It makes you sound tough. But they were out of control, these young men, undermining traditional authorities, undermining traditional smuggling routes, and something had to be done. As a result, Sunni militiamen began to cooperate with the Americans against Al-Qaeda. Members of the Sunni resistance who fought the Americans and engaged in organized crime just couldn't take it anymore. These new militias, called awakening groups or Sons of Iraq or concerned local citizens, critical infrastructure security guards, Iraqi security volunteers, are for the most part former members of the resistance. I've spent a lot of time with them in Baghdad and elsewhere, members of the 1920 Revolution Brigade, the Islamic Army of Iraq, Army of the Mujahideen, and other groups. Now, the tactic of the U.S. supporting these armed groups worked best in the Anbar province. It's partially worked in Baghdad, although many Iraqis in Baghdad and elsewhere fear that Al-Qaeda has imposed its own ceasefire, sort of waiting out the surge as well, and that they're lying low. Now, in the very violent Diyala province and in Salahuddin, the Anbar model has so far not succeeded at all. And like the Mahdi army, the Sunni militias hope to wait for the Americans to reduce their troop levels before they resume fighting the Shia militias. Joining these American-backed militias has given them territory in Baghdad and elsewhere that they now control. This was their dream, to seize power in as many areas as possible, and from there eventually seize control of the Iraqi state. And for the first time in a couple of years, they feel optimistic. These Sunni militias also have political goals and are attempting to unite to become a larger movement that will be able to regain Sunni territory and effectively fight the Shia militias and the Shia-dominated government, which they refer to as an as an Iranian occupation. So they say we have a temporary ceasefire, a hudna, with the Americans, so we can fight the Iranian occupation of Iraq, which to them means the Shia-dominated government, the Shia militias. And I actually accompanied a few weeks ago members of some of these Sunni militias from South Baghdad, from Dora to Ramadi, where they paid homage to al-Barisha, the brother of the slain awakening leader that President Bush met, and they hope to join his movement. They didn't view themselves as security guards, they viewed themselves as a nascent political movement. We've achieved military success, now we're going to translate that into some sort of political success. And to them, the main enemy is the Iraqi state. They're very explicit about that, at least when the American soldiers aren't around.